Okay, so we might get started. Welcome everyone to this budget refresher training. It's good to see so many of you attending today. Um, I think this activity is something you all do and we all do once a year. So we use these refresher sessions just to, if you haven't done them, if you haven't done the budget before, it's at least an introduction onto the process. And if you have done it before, it still serves as a good refresher. And I hope to give you some tips that you can do along the way to make that budgeting process a lot easier. So the first thing you need to do, which when you go into board, is to just remember our suggested order of modules. So when you go into board, on the right hand side, you see some buttons called planning. And it's tempting to use this budget icon and jump into budgets, but we actually don't suggest it that way. So we suggest that you do the salaries and wages module first, and then you use the workflow module to complete your budgets. So we actually suggest that you don't click on the budget button at all. The budget module is handy if you're perhaps a manager or executive and you want to see all of your budgets in aggregate in one go. So some of the executives here in National Office, they would use that function. But if you're just doing, particularly if you're a submitter and approver and you want to look at each budget individually, the best way to do that is via the workflow button. So when you open board, this is what your screen looks like. If you have any difficulties in getting to this screen, so you might be a new user, if you need installation or anything similar to that, your best point of call is Biz, and we suggest you get onto them fairly quickly. Otherwise, you go into capsules, open capsule, and you select the budgeting and reporting capsule. In my case, because I'm an admin, I've got a lot more capsules than you would, but you'll typically just have this one. You click OK, and that's the screen that you, it'll come up in a second. This is the screen that you will go into. So if you're working on a laptop, I do suggest going down to the bottom right-hand corner and selecting either 80% or 70%. So 80% works well on my screen. You might do 70% on some laptops. And that's the screen you go into. And like I suggested, you complete the salaries and wages module first, and then you'll jump into workflow. Okay, so remember to be patient with board, particularly when there's large amounts of users coming in, particularly around the budget submission times. So we do suggest you try and complete budgets outside of those peak hours if possible. So what do I need to do? So as I mentioned, we do the salaries and wages module first. So when you go into salaries and wages module, if you're one of your manager's nominated participants to complete salaries and wages, you'll go in and you'll see that there's 6 tabs up the top. The first tab is called existing employees allocation. So this data that you see here, it's based on the latest payroll data that's come out of the ADP portal. There's no editable feature on this. You then go into the next tab, which is existing employees. On this screen, do that sense check again. Is everyone there? You'll be able to see their cost center, their extension, and various other bits of info, as well as their budgeted hours and their budgeted pay rate. So on this screen, the only two columns that are editable are in yellow, and they're the ones where you can do an edit. So typically, if someone is a full-time monthly paid employee, they'll be working 164.6667 hours per month. And if you have a fortnightly paid employee, they'll be 75 hours per fortnight. So generally, if you've got and you can see down here for the finance cost center, most people are full-timers. We do have some people who aren't. So for example, 98.8 hours. So if you do simple arithmetic and you would do 98.8 divided by 164.6667, that tells you it's a 0.6 of an FTE. So that's 3 days a week. So make any adjustments that you need to for any staff members. Generally, the data is correct, but if you can foresee that there's going to be changes coming for the next financial year, that's the place to update them as well. Generally, no need to change the budgeted pay rate. That would only be in exceptional circumstances, and we suggest you contact us if that's the case. You'll notice these columns are blank at the moment. That's okay. They're going to be completed in the next tab, and I'll show you that now. So we then move on to this column here called Review Existing Employees. And at the moment, as you can see, these columns are blank at the moment. So we've got to tell Board to do a calculation for us. And you'll notice on this particular tab, there's no screens that you can edit. So the way to do that calculation in Board is there's this button in the top sort of right, and it's called the Calculate Planning for Existing Employees. So basically you press that button, you get a pop-up telling you that Board's running a procedure, and then just be patient, so a couple of moments, and then you'll see that automatically, I've obviously hidden it here, but salaries and wages data gets populated automatically here. So do a sense check to make sure that the salaries and the FTEs and all that sort of thing make sense to you. Generally, there's no reason why Board wouldn't calculate it correctly, and it has done in the past. Where there has been error, it's usually due to sort of some element of human error. So an example could be an extra zero has been added to the budgeted pay rate, or the budgeted hours are missing a digit or something like that. So that's what usually drives the error. Do that sense check, correct any errors. One really handy tip though, is that with your existing employees, if you know that an employee is about to terminate, there's something that you need to do. So in the tab called Existing Employees, you click the termination date button. A pop-up will come up like this, and it's going to be asking you which month you think that employee will terminate. So the tip here is to select the month after they depart. So if I were to tick this October button here, it's implying that I think that the employee will depart on 30 September. So use your best estimate and make sure you click the button after when you think an employee might be going on leave or might be terminating at the Smith family. If it's a fixed term contract, for example, and you know that the employee will depart on 30 June 2022, you don't need to enter a termination date at all. And that will be dealt with in the next financial year's budget, so FY23. We'll now move on to input new employees. So a really important thing to remember here is that only one person in each workflow should input new employees. So we want to avoid situations where there's a submitter inputting new employees and then an approver doing it as well. Board just does not like that and doesn't calculate it properly. So we say one person in the workflow at any time. If we know that a submitter has submitted and an approver wants some amendments to be made, the way to do that is to reject the budget back down to the submitter, and that submitter can make those amendments. I've got a question here asking, do we terminate employees if the employee is being seconded? I presume that means to another cost centre. The answer is yes. And I'll actually go through that in a little while about that to tell you exactly what we suggest the process to be. So with input new employees, we basically, you click, there's a couple of columns up here which all need to be completed. You click to add an employee, and then you just work through each of these columns. So you type in their name, their cost center, the extension, whether they're full-time, casual or part-time, whether they're monthly or fortnightly paid employees, the location where they'll sit, when they will commence, in case you might put a date in if they're a fixed term contract, when they terminate, what their budgeted hours are, what their pay rate is, and if they're split between two cost centers. So I've sort of done this example to cover all of the situations I can think of. So examples where people are continuing on, where people are terminating during the year, when budgeted hours are not standard, when you're having a split between two cost centers and that sort of thing. So pop-ups do come up, so it's not you having to type things in manually. It's all a pop-up, and you just sort of click through the process and it's fairly easy to do. Once you've input all of that data, you then click another button in that top right-hand side. And this time it's a slightly different looking button. It's called Calculate Planning for New Employees. So you sort of press that button and then Board does some calculations. And basically you then can see the result of those calculations in the next tab. So the next tab is called Review New Employees. And you can basically see that's what the calculation ends up looking like. So do those checks to see that the calculations appear correct. In my case here, I can look at that straight away and say, well, no, those salary amounts or salary and wages amounts look really, really low. And that's because I've put in a budgeted rate of $1 per hour. So do those sense checks and make sure that it all makes sense to you. The final thing is you can then do a complete review of what you've done about your existing employees and your new employees. So you can go onto the next tab called the P&L Preview. On this tab, it's really great because it allows for our on costs to appear and be calculated as well. So on costs are things like your long service leave, your super, and also your workers' comp. So the total of all of those three items is 11.9%. So when you're thinking of new roles, remember in the back of your mind that an additional 11.9% will be added as well as on costs. I'm going to do some quick Q&As that I thought might be handy. So what happens when an employee changes from one cost centre to another cost centre, either right at the start of the financial year or during the year? And Paula, as you said, perhaps what happens if they're being seconded to another cost centre? So the way we need to do it is in the existing cost centre, they do need to be terminated. And then the same employee needs to be added as a new employee in the new cost centre. So often there'll be two different cost centres involving two different managers. So we suggest that the two budget owners just do that communication to make sure we're moving and definitely including that staff member in both cost centres, and also making sure that the dates are lining up as well. So we're, terminating one person in November and then re-putting that same employee in the other cost centre in December. We're not mixing or losing any staff data or staff wages in that process. We've said here that the salaries and wages module needs to only be input by one person. What if the approver doesn't agree with what the submitter's done? So the approver should reject the budget back to the submitter, and then the approver and submitter should have a conversation outside of board, and the approver should, tell the submitter what amendments need to be made. So we suggest having that conversation outside of board. It makes that process a lot easier. Third question is, what do we do if an employee has a new hourly rate during FY22? So what you can do is terminate the employee in that old role and add that new employee at the new rate using the Add New Employee function. We have a question, why do we have to press those buttons to calculate salaries and wages? Why doesn't this happen automatically? So this is about doing the salaries and wages module and then later having to pull the data in the workflow module. So that pull is a manual process. And the reason it's a manual process is because if we were to tell the two modules, being the salaries and wages module and the workflow module, to continually send data between each other, it would be multiple pockets of data every second, and it would completely overload the board server. So that's why we have a manual process, and I'll be showing you how to do that very shortly. How do I input the hire date for an employee if I don't know exactly when they'll start? So we do ask for your best estimate, but also factor in the time that you will take to advertise a position, do interviews, a notice period and that sort of thing. So, typically if you know that you'll start recruiting on 1 July, you might not have that employee started on 1 July either. So factor in that time of when they might start. And do you have to calculate the on costs yourself? So no, you don't need to. And just remember, it's in that P&L preview tab. Just going to open it up for any questions just now. Otherwise, I've got some questions at the end as well. Looks like no questions. Okay, so we'll move on to the workflow module. So you've done that salaries and wages module. You're done. Now we're going to go on to the workflow module. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you a little trick here. So we're back onto Board Live, and let's say I'm clicking the workflow module. So remember, we've gone through a process of workflow confirmations with all managers, and you will only have access to the workflows that relate to your role. So in my case, I've got access to all workflows, and that's just because I'm an admin. A really good tip, if you do have a fairly, and some managers might have a long list of workflows that they do need to work through, a tip is to click the triangle sort of that comes up, and then click this magnifying glass. And then if you know your cost center, you can very quickly go in. So I know my cost centers for finance is 323, and it comes up like that. So at that point, okay, I've narrowed down to the cost center that I want to go into, and there's going to be 3 buttons here. At this point in time, you've got 3 buttons. It's the edit button, and that's where you use to input the budget. You've got the pre-populate button, which is the tick, and that's basically telling Board that I want to pre-fill from last year's budget. So that's quite a handy feature. And then we've got the erase button to erase all data. So with the pre-populate button, while it is tempting to use it, we suggest using that with a bit of caution, or even perhaps not using it at all. And the reason is that we don't want you to blindly input last year's budget into this year's screen and just hit submit. We do want you to sort of pay a bit of attention as to what expenditure you will actually incur, and it might be different from last year, particularly if there were one-offs last year that won't recreate this year, or also looking at the phasing of expenditure. So you might have last year realised that no, the actual timing of the expenditure that you incur doesn't quite match to how you'd budgeted it for last year, and this is an opportunity to sort of improve that as well. So we do suggest, you're welcome to look at last year's budget, of course, but we actually suggest using the edit function instead. Now, if you do decide to use pre-populate, you will get a warning message like this, and that basically means that anything that you've entered beforehand, or if you're an approver and your submitter has already input data and sent it to you, if you click this button, any existing data will be cleared. So just be very, very careful if you do use the pre-populate button as to when you're pressing that button, and the potential for data loss if someone's already started a budget. Same for the erase button. You will get a pop-up, but once that button's clicked, the data is gone. So just be very conscious of when you're clicking and saying yes for data to be erased. So let's say I've pressed the edit button, and I'm ready to go into Board and be able to input data. And you will go in and you'll see a screen like this. So basically, there's a long list of rows where you can input income if you're a cost center that has fundraising. Otherwise, the vast majority of you will only have expenses. And you'll see that because you've gone via the workflow is the same as a cost center, so you're doing one at a time. But you can only input data into the budget when cells are yellow. So you might have a question of, well, none of my cells are yellow. I can't seem to edit anything. And so the answer is that you need to select 1 out of 255 extensions. So if I go back one slide, you'll see I had selected here 255 out of 255 extensions. So what I'm actually telling Board is that I'm trying to do 255 budgets at once, which Board won't let you do. So you've got to select 1 cost center and 1 extension, and that will generally make all of your cells yellow. You also need to be able to have those cells as yellow, you actually need to be part of that workflow group that your manager's nominated. So you basically need that permission. And the budget actually has to be with you to either be approving or submitting. So if the budget's not up to your level yet, so it's still with the submitter and you might be a level 2 approver, you won't be able to edit anything until that budget flows onto you. So one of the first things that you would do typically is to pull the data from the salaries and wages module that you just completed. And the way to pull that is you go sort of to the top right, and there's a button here with 2 arrows, and that's basically the refresh button or the pull button. And what it'll do is all the data that you entered in the salaries and wages module, it'll populate it into the workflow module here. You can do this as many times as you like. So the idea is that if you've done the salaries and wages module and then you, for whatever reason, you need to do it again, or your manager's told you that they want some amendments done, you can pull this data back into your budget module as many times as you like. Really important though is that I'd suggest all managers do double check that the data has been pulled. So we had instances last year where the latest data wasn't pulled through into the budget, and that caused some budget inaccuracies. So let's say I go into the finance budget here, and we're going in live. One thing that I talked about was that there's lots and lots of rows. So if I were to scroll down, there's like so many rows, and some of them might not apply to me. So in finance, the income doesn't apply to me, and it's probably annoying to have it here. Again, go to that triangle up the top, and if you press the negative sign, and that just condenses everything down like that. You can then select the ones that apply to you. So for example, if I'm working on other expenses, I can just open that up and input data there. So one of the tips that we really suggest you do is to export your budget in Excel. And the way you do that is you click on any script, any cell, right click, and this pop-up comes up, and then you click export data to Excel. And once you've exported it, it looks something like this. You can use this as a template to enter in all your income, expenditure, all that sort of thing. We've had success with some managers, and I know Molly, you're on the line. Last year, your team were able to export this in Victoria and actually discuss the budget even before the official budget opening date. And people had great success in being able to communicate with their managers for changes and all that sort of thing well ahead of time. If you do it in this template, it's really great because you can copy from Excel and paste directly into Board. So the way to do it is to select the cells, use Control-C, which is copy in Excel, and then quickly select at least 2 cells in Board. So really quickly hold your mouse over it and then do Control-V. I've got a comment here that Smita highly recommends this method. So we absolutely recommend this method too. During the rest of the period, you can make, we really suggest you make frequent exports of the Excel file for your own records. So again, if something happens, such as your manager accidentally erasing all data by pressing the erase button or something similar like that, at least you've got all your numbers and all your comments as well saved in Excel. So we do encourage you to both use it as a template, but also to save your budget in Excel for your own records as well. Once budgets are locked, so that sort of process happens once we go through to the directors for approval. Once that budget is locked, you don't need to use Excel anymore because the budget's locked in play and no changes can be made anyway. 2 handy tips: use the notes function in Board. So towards the right, there's cells that you can use to enter your notes. It really helps approvers understand why you've entered in what you've inputted, and also it's a great memory jogger many months from now when you having the notes in there. It also helps us in finance as well to see what you've done. The other thing is when you enter numbers or notes into Board, they'll be as red. That means that the data is not saved. You need to press the F9 key on your keyboard to save it regularly, or you can press the tick button. You need to save that regularly. Once something goes to black and you pressed F9, that's when the data is saved. So just remember to press F9 as much as you can. So we're nearly done. We just do final steps. So you've inputted your budget. So the way you do that is you tick the box next to the workflow that you want to submit, and then you press the green tick button as well. So that sends it to the next level of approver. If you're an approver and you need to reject a budget back down, similarly, you tick the checkbox for reject, and then you press the arrow going backwards, and that rejects it back down to the level before. So if you're in some situations, we often have the same person might be submitter and approver level 1, or we might have the same person being approver level 1 and 2. In those situations, you do need to approve twice, or you need to reject twice. So you might need to do that a few times if you see that in the workflow you're the same person for 2 or 3 different elements of the workflow. Remember that budgets open on Monday. So with that, we expect budgets to be submitted by the 1st of April. And then your manager may have communicated an earlier date with you. So do keep that in mind. And then all budgets need to be approved all the way to execs by 9 April as well. So that's probably it from my end. We'll now open up for questions.
I'm recalling last year, and maybe it was just because we got into the detail and we made it really complicated, but with the salaries, HR automatically calculates the new increase. Is that right? So when we're looking at salaries, we are not adding on that increase. That's already in there. And then one of the things that I think we really noted last year was that sometimes team members who should have been on similar levels, their budget pay rate and there were like these very minor differences. And I note in this session you said just don't touch the pay rate without kind of talking about it with you guys first. Yeah. So just kind of cross-checking. Do you know like kind of the reason behind that, or is there any? Should we just kind of? Yeah.
So
strange.
So sort of alluding to what you said earlier, the pay rates are set. So they're kind of set in conjunction with HR and finance together. But basically some employees, while they might appear to be on the same level, the only difference that I can think of is that one is entitled to a grade increase, whereas another employee might not be eligible for that grade increase right then. I think that's because of start dates and whatnot. So you might see some employees, and again, it's very minor, as you mentioned, but you might see some of those employees at a different rate, and that's the reason. So some have just factored in what you call a standard award increase, but some employees have both an award increase and a grade increase. So that's why employees that might be on similar levels just have a slightly different rate because of their grading in that EBA, like the EBA system. Yeah, but as I suggested, don't change those rates. And final note, the best way to contact us is on the board support email. So we've got 3 or 4 of us monitoring that inbox regularly. The tougher questions will come to me, but some of the easier, quickly answered questions might be answered by my team as well. Kathy's got a question. Will you share the PowerPoint? Yes, I will. It'll be on the Zoom, on the finance section shortly. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. We really appreciate you attending this session. The budget process is really it's a very collaborative process. You know, we rely on you, and we give this training on the flip side, we give this training to help you guys out a bit. So hopefully this session's been helpful. Again, any questions to that support inbox. Otherwise, good luck next week, and I'm sure all of us will be in touch with you at some stage. So thanks very much, everyone. Bye-bye.